Welcome to our next story from a hometown scrapbook. This one's called The King of the Fiji Islands. Hello there. We have a story tonight that reads like something out of a Stevenson or Nordhoff and Hall. It's a story that we can't rightly begin or end, but there is enough in the middle of it to make it one of Grays Harbor's best and earliest yarns of the men who went down to the seas in ships in the harbor's earliest and saltiest days. It's a tale that I want to call The King of the Fiji Islands because no other title seems to fit it quite so well. It's the story that deals with one of Grays Harbor's finest and keenest old-timers, whose own story would read like something out of a fiction if we could put it all together. So when Dick Crombie has used up a few seconds we allowed him for our sponsor, we'll tell you the story of Pete, the beachcomber who made Grays Harbor a stopping place on his lifetime cruise to the ranks of royalty, and the monumentous voyage of Tom Sowell and some long-remembered companions when Grays Harbor was very young. Dick, first it's your turn. Grays Harbor was enjoying the land boom of the 1890s, even though it had not shown on a good many maps of this Northwest, when Hoquiam had a citizen who was known to most people as only Pete. And not only was his name unknown to most, but so was his background. Moreover, very few people were interested in Pete. He was one of those sea rovers who had drifted into the harbor on a white-winged sailing ship and had dropped his own personal anchor to stay ashore as a landlubber. Pete was not the usual run of drifters. He put together a small shanty down on the Hoquiam River near the mouth of the Hoquiam River and set up housekeeping. His wood pile was as neat and as long as his house, and his cabin was pin neat with its well-scrubbed floor and broomed porch. Pete found odd jobs around the mills, not hard work, for Pete had passed the milestone into that thing called middle age, and a lifetime of hard work had made him yearn for something just a little easier than the holy stoning decks and beating down canvases in the southeast gale. He worked in the yard at the old Northwestern Mill as a cleanup man, and during the fishing season found odd jobs mending nets and helping to scrape down the occasional beach boat. In fact, his capable hands were often in demand, for Pete always did a little more than he was paid for. And he was clean, agreeable, and had a raft of stories to tell his friends in his thick Norwegian accent when the crew sat down for a smoke. Pete disappeared a couple of times in 1891. He locked the door of his little cabin and, taking most of his belongings, shipped aboard a schooner. He did a common seaman's trick on one of the little schooners, plying the lumber trade with the South. But after each trip south, he was back again, and the smoke twisted skyward from his breakfast fires, and the lamp glowed in his cabin window, or on a stormy autumn night. Pete made few friends, and those only among waterfront people. But one of them was Tom Sowell, who lived close to the high water mark and was never very much disassociated with salty spray and things floating. Tom recalls the man as a jack of all trades and a good citizen, but not one given to much talk about himself. Well, as we said, Pete lived here for a few years, taking an occasional voyage out to break the monotony on the beach. And then one day, as he walked out of his little cabin and left the door behind him unlocked. No one looked inside, but if they did, they would have noted that he had left very little behind. and no one noted either that he had shipped aboard a schooner loaded for the South Seas. So it was some months before the waterfront noted that Pete had packed up and left. And after a fair length of time, another drifter moved into his cabin, and smoke appeared from a new breakfast fire. It was a day of drifters for Grays Harbor. This was a new port of call, and sailors who had shipped on a packet that didn't suit their style jumped ship and lived there a while on the beach until they got the saltwater fever again and had to have that feeling of the rolling deck under their feet or die. There were many characters who dropped their hooks for a spell, only to continue on to another spot and another, as is the way with men who are afraid of gathering moss. So Tom Sowell noted, along with some other Hoquiam waterfront folks, that old Pete was gone, and that was that. Now, as Tom can recall, it was the year of 1893 when he shipped aboard the schooner J.M. Weatherwax for a voyage to the South Pacific. The schooner, which had been built here on Grays Harbor and was the harbor's pride and joy, as the sleekest thing yet launched at the local shipyard, was bound for a voyage down under to the Fiji archipelago that uninitiated folks called the Fiji Islands. Tom wanted to get a look at those islands, and so did Johnny Perry and Tom Haynes. Johnny was the brother of Maud Perry, today Maud Perry Douglas, and one of Grays Harbor's most charming old-timers. So the three of them signed on the schooner, and when she was loaded and deck loaded, the three Grays Harbor men took a long last look at Washington's coast as it faded in the distance, and they set their sights on the tropical landfall. There were fair winds and friendly seas, and the J.M. Weatherwax beat a clean take south by southwest. Captain Charlie Hughes, well known on Grays Harbor for the ships he had brought in here, was the skipper of the J.M. Weatherwax, and Tom's official title was supercargo. Captain Hughes ran a tight ship, and with favorable winds they made good time into the tropics. They passed north and west to the Salmon Islands and caught landfall in Coral Sea that washes the coral strands of Vanuatu that some sailors call the Exploring Islands. They skirted the lush green gem that is known as Nari and its big sister that is called Nagu. And then one morning, with a clean breeze and the morning glinting on the palm trees, the J.M. Weatherwax beat a careful track through the coral heads and dropped its hook in the harbor at Suva. To Tom Sowell and his fellow Grays Harborites, it was the loveliest sight this side of heaven. And if you've ever made a tropical landfall before the sun comes up to change the colors, when the hills climb lush and verdant from the blue-black waters, and the coral looks like a snap line of orchids at the water's edge, when the shadows are deep with mystery and night keeps one hand on the tropics quiet. If you've ever seen this, you'll understand the wide-eyed wonder with which these young men looked at this new land. In the days that followed, Tom, as supercargo, took over the unloading of the ship's lumber, precious as gold to the South Sea traders who handled every stick with care and affection. For Captain Hughes, it was a chance to meet old friends and drink them down. English, German, Australian, and New Zealanders skippers sat down with the Yankees in port and spliced the main brace in the approved custom of the sea. The Germans emptied their steins of island-brewed beer, but for the Yankees and the Brittoners, it was double noggins around of heady Australian spirits. For all the skippers carried, the J.M. Weatherwax could sink at the dock while they renewed their old acquaintances. It was when the ship had been pretty well cleared and was taking on a light hold cargo for the return voyage that Tom learned of a missionary brig headed south for a quick cruise through the islands. The little vessel provisioned the missions scattered throughout the Vides and brought them mail and their missionary requirements. Tom had met the skipper on the waterfront, They had exchanged pipes full, and the captain of the brig had invited them to make a cruise with him. As he figured it, there was just time to make the swing south to Vatafella, Ilbenga, Candova. Candova, the brig's skipper described, was the most perfect of the South Sea Islands, a larger island directly south of Suva, 100 miles, populated with Tahitian natives. You haven't seen the South Seas until you've seen Candova, the skipper of the mission ship told Tom. So Tom found it convenient to turn his duties over to a subordinate and accept the invitation to sail to the mission. It was the trip that Tom remembered to this day as one of the highlights of his saltwater years. We'll discover it as Tom recalls some of its highlights. But first, Dick Crombie requires a few seconds of our time for a message from our sponsors. Sailing south from Suva in the Pacific in the 1890s would be something for any man to remember. For those were the South Seas of Captain Cook and Abel Tasman, unspoiled, unsullied, and by all but the most adventurous of white men. The Fijis, unlike many of the South Sea Islands, volcanic in origin, and their jagged peaks rise out of the azure sea like green houndstooths with coral frames. The luxurious vegetation, clustering cloud formations, their jewel-like brilliance in the tropic sun, made pictures to clutch to the heart for a lifetime. At the southern extreme of their circuit, the little brig put into Candova, an island about 25 miles long, narrow, well-timbered, and with a good harbor. It contained a Wesleyan training institute, and the skipper carried a packet of mail and some necessities of life for the missionary director who met the boat. He invited the skipper and Tom ashore, and in a small boat they rowed to the beach, where a handful of curious natives watched them quizzically. Down a coral road to the beach, another band of natives was moving forward. They were bearing a pole chair on their shoulders, and Tom could see someone. A king, no doubt, riding in the chair above the dark mass of the islanders who marched ahead and behind their leader. As Tom, the bark's skipper, and the missionaries walked across the cornmeal sands of the coral beach, the party of natives stopped on the coral road that ran inland to the mission, and Tom could see that the man who rode above them in the pole chair was a white man with a red-gray beard. He was festooned with flowers on his head and wore a strange headgear. The missionary explained, "He's a sailor who has come here some time ago and was befriended by the natives. His influence was so great that they made him their king." The natives waited as the three white men approached. The king, resplendent in his borne chair, with attendants standing all about him. And then, Tom can still hardly believe it, after more than 55 years of thinking about it, then he recognized the man in the chair. Yes, as you probably guessed, it was Pete. Pete, the globe-trotting Norseman, who had swept the docks of the old Northwestern mill, who had batched in a shack at the mouth of the Hoquiam River, who had called Gray's Harbor home port in the early 1890s. Pete had climbed to the heights of ambition of all seafaring men of his time. He had become the king of a South Sea island, and incidentally enshrined himself as the only king so far recorded in this, our hometown scrapbook. Thanks for listening.